Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have anti-ICE protesters arrested in Pearl River over use of profanity from NOLA.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, if you want to swear, I don't think swearing should be illegal. I've always been for free speech. If you want to swear at anyone, if you want to swear at ICE officers, I personally think you should be able to do so. With that being said, it just goes, I don't think, it doesn't really matter if swearing is illegal or not. If the government feels like you're disrespecting them, it doesn't matter if it's legal or not. They can justify arresting you since they have the legal monopolies of force. It doesn't really matter what the laws are or what they're written down. Laws are just words on a piece of paper. What matters is how they're actively enforced. So, yeah, personally, I don't think these people should have been arrested, especially if they were only arrested for their profanity. But, ultimately, the government can justify arresting people for whatever reasons they feel they want to justify, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have an accurate depiction of Republicans 2020 to 2026, posted by Helpful Feeding, and that's a cross post from the Kitchen Confidential subreddit, and that's entitled "That MAGA Customer Who Never Tips and Just Won't Leave" 2020 version versus 2026 version. And yeah, personally, I do think MAGA was more principled against government tyranny when it came to COVID, but suddenly, when it comes to illegal immigration, suddenly, therefore, all the government tyranny, it looks like it's a TikTok of a guy acting that out, MAGA in 2020 versus MAGA in 2026. But, ultimately, it just goes to show you that, when the government does something you don't like, you're obviously going to be against it. When the government does something you support, even if it's done very authoritarianly and tyrannically, that's just because you might agree with what they're doing, doesn't mean you still should be supporting it, because if the government does something you don't support, it could do something. If the government does something you support, you could do something you don't. You could do something you don't support as well with the same fervor. And I think that's very important to remember. It's important to be very consistently against government authoritarianism, regardless of the fact regardless if you personally agree with it or not, because the government giving them more authority over anything isn't something that should be justified, especially when you're looking at it from a libertarian perspective, I would say. Next, we have Divided and Distracted, Lessons from History from Median.com, posted by The Chaotic Mage. And yeah, personally, I definitely do agree that we're divided and distracted right now, the American people, I should say. But, ultimately, that's very much how they do it. They got to keep people divided. So it's over wedge issues like LGBTQ, abortion, immigration. So that you don't realize that they agree on like 95% of the stuff. They're basically a uniparty for a reason. And you also got to keep them distracted with stuff like bread and circuses and the culture war and all that. Like everyone's constantly arguing over the Super Bowl halftime show of Bad Bunny and Turning Point having its own Super Bowl halftime show of Kid Rock. And it just goes to show you that when you keep people divided and distracted, there's never going to be any meaningful change. And the Trump era is very much a good example of that. People are always like, Trump's gonna collapse the country any day now. But regardless, the American empire just keeps on keeping on, regardless of what knucklehead is in the White House. And it just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter who's in the White House or who's running the government, I would say. The president's mostly just a figure. I would say the deep state's the one really running the government, like the military-industrial complex or the alpha agencies like CIA, FBI, etc., etc. But regardless, that's people are too divided and distracted by other stuff to really enact any meaningful change, and that's very much what social media is. Social media, I think, has made a lot of people very complacent when it comes to stuff. We can only be glad that didn't exist at the time of the American Revolution, or I think the founding fathers would just block George III on Twitter and called it a day. I think people are very complacent right now too, in addition to divided and distracted, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have FBI concluded Jeffrey Epstein wasn't running a sex trafficking ring for powerful men file show from APnews.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the FBI. If they want to say something, I think they should be able to, but you can't trust anything. Well, I guess you could trust whatever, you should be able to trust whatever the government says, but you definitely should always look at what the government says with a grain of salt, especially when it comes to the alpha agencies like the FBI or the CIA. The FBI can say whatever it wants to, but that doesn't necessarily make it true. Jeffrey Epstein, of course, Trump's administration is very much compromised by Israel, and Jeffrey Epstein was very much likely working for the Israeli CIA and Mossad. So that's why I think his government won't ever go after him and say anything bad about him, because ultimately, he was just there to really gather dirt on the elites like Trump and Bill Clinton and Bill Gates and all of them pretty much. And it just goes to show you that they're never gonna uh, say he's guilty of anything. They did say he's guilty of sex trafficking, but they're never gonna say to whom, because it was very much a blackmail operation to discredit the elite class. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump accused of role in Epstein's death and tips sent to FBI files reveal from the Independent.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if Trump had a role in Epstein's death. People say, "Oh, he killed himself." Well, I personally don't believe he killed himself. He might have been. I think either Trump or the Clintons or some other member of the elite class probably hired some muscle to take him out, and that's my thoughts there. He might even still be alive today. You don't know, because you never really saw the body. They just kind of said that he was dead. So yeah, personally, if he is dead, I personally think Trump might have played a role in it. Maybe the Clintons did too. Maybe Bill Gates. A lot of people had a very clear reason for wanting him dead with all the blackmail he had on them, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Irishman detained by ICE appeals to Tal Siach, I think that's like the Irish president, I can never really pronounce that word, to raise case with Trump amid torture, from IrishTimes.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, if it was a legal Irish immigrant, it looks like it might have been, they shouldn't have been detained. They shouldn't be detaining him. And but ultimately, as I said, it doesn't matter what anyone's immigration status is. ICE has legal monopoly on the use of force, justify enforcing whatever it feels like. And it doesn't really matter what's written down on the piece of paper, what the laws are. It matters how the laws are enforced. And so, if the ICE wants to detain anyone for any reason, they pretty much have a blank check to justify whatever they want to. Next, we have innocent Americans already swept up in Trump's mass voter purge, from RawStory.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the elections at all. I think elections are democracy is inherently tyranny of the majority and forced collectivism. I think in the libertarian perspective, you should have voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. If people want to have like a commune and vote on issues among consenting members, I think that's fine. But right now, it's at such a scale that not everyone can consent to it, and I think that's important to remember as well. But regardless, I don't really care if Trump wants to purge the voter rolls for whatever reason. Ultimately, he might not be doing it for the purest reasons, but ultimately that's another reason why I think he shouldn't probably have democracy or elections. The government inherently is going to have control over them and what counts as a vote, and they're going to be inherently biased towards keeping themselves in power. You can't really vote yourself free, and that's very much the libertarian position. It's always going to be there's some tyrant who's going to use democracy as a pretext to justify enforcing authoritarianism on you. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Ghislaine Maxwell pleads the Fifth in front of House Committee, offers to clear Trump's name in exchange for clemency, from People.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think that she should be let off the hook. But if she wants to justify that, she should be able to. I think it's interesting how anti-Ghislaine Maxwell Reddit tends to be, even though she was arguably a mod for one of the biggest subs in world news. They'll say that's conspiracy theory, but it all adds up. U/Maxwell Ho is very likely Ghislaine Maxwell, and she stopped, and the account conveniently went dark right after she got arrested, and it just goes to show you that Reddit's very much should be held accountable for its role in the Epstein stuff as well, because they're letting they've removed me as moderator from tons of subs, but they've never. Ghislaine Maxwell gets to moderate a huge sub, and no one really cares, because Reddit's very much another tool of the elite class to control people. It's all connected, I would say. Next, we have the best example of taxes not being theft because it benefits everyone, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that looks like a tweet or an Instagram post or some kind of social media post from some guy named Tron Solberg71. Hi, smiley face emoji, Norwegian here. People assume we pay huge taxes, but we really don't. Median pay in Norway equals 26% tax. The investment buys you free childbirth, 1 year paid parental leave, affordable daycare, 120 per month, free education for PhD, 1 year paid sick leave, healthcare costs capped at $330 per year, guaranteed level pension and more. That's a lot of peace of mind for 26%. And yeah, personally, I think if people want to pay a 26% tax for all that, I think they should be able to. I've always supported voluntary taxation, but I don't think people should be forced to pay that tax if they don't want to. Also, it disregards the fact that the Norwegian demographics and the population size are vastly different than the U.S., so it might not work the same here. But yeah, ultimately, I think libertarian position is if people want to voluntarily pay taxes for all that stuff, I think they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to do so if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Republicans getting two birds with one stone, posted by FastSaverina739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And then that's a meme of one guy talking to another guy. He says, "We need to keep the frog people out, the frog people," and the other guy says, "Well, we can just increase welfare and say it's because of the frog people." And then the other guy then he says, "There's no way people will fall for that." And then the other guy just smiles, and then the OP added more welfare and less brown, and parentheses frog people. And ultimately, I would agree with all that. We shouldn't be justifying increasing welfare. Because there already enough welfare, and it's just illegal immigrants are going to get on it. I personally am fine with immigration. I'm for freedom of movement. With that being said, when you have mass unchecked illegal immigration and allow for a lot of them getting in on the welfare state, you definitely do have to cap it at some point. And that's important to remember as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna see if there's anything. I don't think there's anything. So it looks like there's nothing new. So we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.